And of the lymphocytes that we had just talked about, we identified B cells, T cells, natural killer cells as major soldiers of the lymphatic system. The primary cells involved in disease resistance. So now we're going to look at what disease resistance is and the major tissues of the lymphatic system proper before exploring the mechanics of disease resistance. So disease resistance. Being resistant to diseases. Being resistant to invading pathogens. Pathogens are a broad class of organisms, something that wants to cause you harm, something that might cause disease. Different kinds of fungus, viruses, prions, bacteria, parasites, all considered as pathogens. And so we have a variety of defenses in place to fight this variety of pathogens. Not the same systems are employed to fight each of these individual pathogens. So if we are able to counter the actions of a pathogen, we are said to resist its actions. We have resistance, or we have a characteristic called immunity. If the body employs defenses against these pathogens, it's said to have immunity to a disease or resistance to that disease. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, if we're unable to fight the actions of that pathogen, we are susceptible, not resistant. So this lays the groundwork for the terminology. We'll look at the two different types of immunity that we already mentioned, not in depth, but we'll articulate what we mean by each type, and then discuss the lymphatic system today. I realize this slide isn't in the slide set that I posted, but I thought that it was some nice clarification just to get everyone on the same page with what we're talking about, what it means to be resistant or immune and or susceptible. On the side of immunity, of disease resistance, there are two forms, and the first form is non-specific. It's broad and it's general, and we have this system in place from birth. We call this innate immunity. These are defense mechanisms including the physical barrier of your skin to the environment that protects you against invading bacteria and other pathogens. Something like lysozyme that we talked about last class, a broad antibacterial agent, would be part of the innate immunity or non-specific disease resistance system. On the flip side, we have the ability to learn from past mistakes. The lymphatic system can adapt, can generate antibodies against a particular pathogen or foreign substance that we've encountered previously, so that the response in future is facilitated. So that if we come into contact with that foreign substance again, we don't have to spend as much time coming up with an antidote, figuring out a solution. We already have the blueprints on hand to be able to generate a response. And hopefully it's a somewhat more effective response than the first time we encountered the pathogen. And so these are the two branches of our immune system. And the goal today is not to explore these in detail. We will look at the mechanisms behind each, probably starting tomorrow. But understand that these are the actions of the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is the system that deals with disease resistance. And so we don't quite understand yet what the lymphatic system is. We know that it's there. We've seen one small part of it. I introduced to you the white blood cells that are ingredients to the recipe. But we don't understand the layout of the lymphatic system yet, so that's our goal today. Wordy slide coming up. No animations. The lymphatic system, shown here on the right-hand side, all these green highlighted areas are part of the lymphatic system. And it contains not only vessels. Question down here, yeah?
Have you opened the colon yet?
That's a good question. Nope. I have not opened the colon yet. Thank you for keeping me honest. There we go. Polling is open. What was I asking you on each of those last few slides? So there's a couple related to leukocytes and white blood cells, or kinds of lymphocytes, which, if you'll entertain my brief tangent, one of the questions is back here on this slide that we looked at the end of last class. So there's a few questions about the white blood cells, and then luckily so far in our intro we haven't covered a lot of information related to the new questions. The first question that we would have covered today would have been here. We just talked about innate versus adaptive immunity. There's a question about that. Let's continue on. Thank you for pointing that out. Where were we? The immune system, the lymphatic system, various structures. Bone marrow, red bone marrow is part of the lymphatic system. The spleen is an organ that's part of the lymphatic system. All these vessels and ducts are part of the lymphatic system. And the fluid within those vessels, called lymph, also part of the lymphatic system. So many different pieces to the puzzle. Lymph, by the way, is very, very similar to the interstitial fluid. Another question. Has that been up there the whole time?
No.
No? Since I switched back. Okay. Okay. Questions are open. You can all see them. You can answer. Yeah? This looks clear, which is good. Let's keep rolling. We're adaptive. Perfect opportunity to come across these obstacles. So, lymph. Very similar to interstitial fluid. There's almost complete movement of fluid and proteins between the two compartments, or at least absorbed from the interstitial fluid into the lymph. Backflow is a little bit more difficult, and we'll see that coming up today, but the constituents are very similar between lymph and interstitial fluid. One big difference is that the lymph contains many of the white blood cells, and specifically lymphocytes, that make up the workers of the immune system. So many different parts. Lymphatic vessels are this network that carry the lymph. Red bone marrow is a place where we produce some white blood cells. The spleen as well. The thymus, one of the major organs that we'll talk about probably tomorrow at this point. What else? The cisterna chyli will be something that we bring up later today. It's a nexus, a point of connection right in the middle of the body, where all of the vessels from the lower portion of the body meet. So that will come back up later. I just highlight it here because it's a nice obvious enlargement in the center of the body in one of the major ducts that returns lymph to the blood. So that will come back later. But here we have a roadmap, much like we saw the entire arterial system laid out or the venous system laid out. The lymphatic system is laid out here with its major components. And so its job is at least threefold. We focused on the disease resistance part so far, but it helps to restore blood volume. And in fact, about 3 liters per day of fluid that escapes the blood I hear a lot of rumbling. Yeah, okay. I answered the question that was on the slide set. About 3 liters of fluid per day is returned to the blood via the lymphatic system after escaping from the blood vessels, after escaping from the arteries or the capillaries. About 3 liters per day. Usually it's kept within the vasculature, but some of it can escape and it needs to be returned. If it's not immediately reabsorbed, the lymphatic system returns it to the blood. We also know, because we acknowledge this in the digestion section, this system is responsible for absorbing and sending fat and fat-soluble vitamins to tissues of the body, to the liver to be packaged, to adipose to be stored, and anywhere else that they need to go. So fat, we saw the process of absorption and packaging into chylomicrons that are absorbed by the lacteals. The lacteals are part of the lymphatic system. And the fat-soluble vitamins listed here, A, D, E, and K, for you nutrition buffs, are absorbed through this system as well. And lastly, but not least, the lymphatic system does what we're setting out to describe in this section, carry out the immune responses, which are the specific responses to invading pathogens, again, the detail of which is coming up soon. 3 major functions. The emphasis in this section is on number 3. Unlike the cardiovascular system, the lymphatic system is, how would I describe it? It's more linear. Cardiovascular system is a circuit. It's always renewed. Arteries, capillaries, veins, heart. Arteries, capillaries, veins, heart. The lymphatic system is much more linear, and it begins from a closed portion, from a closed vessel called the lymphatic capillaries. They are closed at one end, a lot like the lacteals that we saw in the small intestine. Individual, linear, little sprigs. These are usually evident sitting between the cells of the body, so bathed in interstitial fluid, and they're anchored there by filaments that extend outwards between the cells. And these capillaries are very porous. They allow a lot of movement of substances into the lymphatic system. And you can see that highlighted by the arrows in this picture. If you look at the arrow as it crosses the dark green border, that is the lymphatic capillary, into the lymph in the middle, you'll see these cells overlap. And the nature of the overlap allows things to be pushed in, so that gap widens when things are pushed in. And then if the pressure inside the capillary ever increases, it seals that opening, so nothing gets pushed out. But they're very easy to open. If there's any extra undue pressure in the interstitial fluid or the cells surrounding the capillary, we can push fluid and solutes and other things into the lymph fairly easily. Those overlapping cells open up And the valve allows flow through. When pressure inside increases, they snap shut. This is really fortunate for any proteins that have escaped the blood. It's not normal for proteins to escape the blood. They're always contained within the blood. And we saw that highlighted in the renal physiology section. But sometimes proteins are released from cells. Or albumin, which is the main protein in blood, is almost small enough to squeeze out of some of the capillaries or between some of the cells. These openings in the lymphatic system are big enough that any protein can flow in. And eventually, all of this stuff that's contained in the capillary is returned to the blood. So any lost proteins are eventually returned to the blood in this manner. So these capillaries are linear. They start as closed dead ends. Fluid proteins can filter in through the opening of those valves. The capillaries are kept in place between the cells by those anchoring filaments, and the filaments also provide a mechanism by which we can open up the capillaries even more. In a situation where a tissue is swollen, where there's fluid accumulating, where there's edema, pressure in the interstitial fluid goes up. The stretch and the pull between those cells is increased. And these filaments that anchor the capillary in place are pulled. And by pulling those filaments, we open up those valves even more to help drain the tissue. If there's ever any undue pressure, the filaments will open up those valves to accelerate drainage of the interstitial fluid. So closed on one end, very linear, unlike the vasculature that's always circular, artery, capillaries, veins. Also important here, the valves are unidirectional. Things can go in easily. They can't go out easily. They need to follow the lymphatic system through to completion. Now these capillaries, like in the vasculature this time, will anastomose into vessels. And those vessels will anastomose into ducts and so on. We'll see that coming up. The lymphatic capillaries merge to form lymphatic vessels. And you can see those lymphatic vessels here in close association with the arteries, capillaries, and veins at X tissue, at a representative tissue. And you'll often find this association. Arteries and veins and lymphatic vessels often will travel together. And they'll even often travel with some nerves. But these vessels will often be found in very close association to allow the exchange of fluid and some other solutes as they run through the body. So we have the capillary network here that branches around the cells within this tissue. The lymphatic vessels also form a bit of a plexus to be able to reach all the nooks and crannies of that tissue, to be in close contact with all the interstitial fluid. And then as lymph flows from the capillaries to the vessels, it'll pass through lymph nodes, which are going to be important in our discussion tomorrow. Probably heard of lymph nodes before, but we don't really know what they are yet. Point is close association. Also note the flow. Note the flow as indicated by the arrows. We have our classic arterial flow of blood, or flow of blood from the arteries through the capillaries and then to the veins. And maybe blood flows through this one capillary portion of the network, or it flows down here but this is the typical flow that we've come to know in our discussion of blood flow and fluid flow in the body. That's what we think of as typical. Notice how the lymphatic system is in play. Whereas fluid flows in the blood and stays within the vasculature, fluid can also flow from the capillaries into the interstitial fluid, where if it doesn't return to the blood, it would be trapped. We don't want it to be trapped. We need to return that to the blood somehow, and it is accomplished by being taken up by the lymphatic system. Eventually it's returned to the blood, and we'll see that coming out. But note the slight differences in flow highlighted here by the arrows. Leaving this tissue, there are two ways fluid leaves, either on the venous side or through the lymphatic vessels. Now, as lymph flows through the lymphatic vessels, it will pass through nodes in series. It must flow through lymph nodes. And lymph nodes will often mark the passage of lymph from vessels into larger structures called trunks. The vessels will anastomose to form trunks. These are larger, common collecting vessels in the lymphatic system. And there are a few of them that we can name them specifically. The lumbar, intestinal, jugular, big long word, bronchomediastinal, and subclavian trunks. And you can see them shown here. Actually, you can't see them shown here. I'm not spending a lot of time detailing where each of these go. The names are actually indicative of what portions of the body they drain. For instance, the jugular trunk will drain all of the lymph from the head. The intestinal trunk will drain all of the lymph from the intestines, so on and so forth. The bronchomediastinal, which is not as obvious, drains lymph from the chest, heart, thorax, and the central portion of the body, the torso. The cisterna chyli that we mentioned briefly earlier, again shown here, it's the point where all of the trunks in the lower portion of the body merge to form one main trunk. And the trunks in the lower portion of the body that merge are the lumbar and intestinal trunks. When those merge together, there are two lumbar, one right and one left. And the intestinal trunk, they merge at the cisterna chyli to form the thoracic duct. The thoracic duct is probably the longest duct in the body, the longest lymphatic duct, one of the most important lymphatic ducts in the body and easily identifiable. You can see it extending all the way from the cisterna chyli up posterior to the heart, and there's some stuff that happens up here that we'll look at coming up. But the thoracic duct, a major duct of the lymphatic system. The other major lymphatic duct would be the right lymphatic duct. Now, I take issue with how it's presented here and in the book. The book tends to flip-flop a little bit. All of the lymphatic vessels in the body drain into one of two ducts. Thoracic duct or lymphatic, the right lymphatic duct. And you'll see highlighted as you read through the book the general pattern of drainage of lymph in the body highlighted here. All of the lymph returning from the lower limbs, from the abdomen, from the left-hand side of the body, eventually flows through the thoracic duct which returns it to the blood. So all of this green area, the lymph from this part of the body, flows through the thoracic duct and then back into the blood. Probably why it's one of the major ducts in the body. Conversely, the right arm, the right side of the head, and the right part of the thorax, lymph from those regions drains through the right lymphatic duct back into the blood. That's the major division highlighted in the book. Those are two major ducts that you should know, because those are the two major avenues by which lymph is returned to the blood. I take issue with that because in the next breath, the book tells you, oh, the right lymphatic duct doesn't really exist. So I'm going to highlight that controversy on the next slide. What I think is a better way to interpret this division is that the lymph from these regions of the body returns to the blood through the left brachiocephalic vein. The thoracic duct enters at the left brachiocephalic vein, and this will be obvious on the next slide. And all the lymph from the yellow shaded areas enters from the right brachiocephalic vein. That's a more clear and obvious distinction where this pattern, this breakdown holds up, not necessarily by the lymphatic ducts themselves, but by the left and right brachiocephalic vein. I think that's a better way to distinguish the lymphatic drainage on this slide. In the next breath, the book tells you that the right lymphatic duct doesn't exist. What then returns lymph to the blood? How, in general, is lymph returned to the blood? If we zoom in, this is obviously the thorax. All the green circuits or vessels are lymphatic vessels, but we're going to zoom in at the point of return, where the lymphatic system merges with the venous system. So if we zoom in on that square highlighted at the top, you can see the subclavian veins as they anastomose with the internal jugular veins to form the two brachiocephalic trunks. It's not labeled because it's a little bit messy, but the left brachiocephalic trunk is on the left-hand side, your right as you look at the slide, and the right is on the opposite slide. They merge to form the superior vena cava. We know that well, right? This is where all of the lymph is returned to the blood. The lymphatic system drains into the blood here, nowhere else. On the right-hand side, where we would expect to find one right lymphatic duct, in fact, we find no common duct, and we find three individual points of entry. Three individual points of entry. The duct draining the right thorax enters independently. The trunk draining the right arm enters independently. And the trunk draining the right side of the head enters independently. All in the same general area. And in very rare cases, in a small percentage of the population, they actually do merge into one vessel. But if we polled the class, 98, 99% would probably show drainage like this. Three independent insertions into the right brachiocephalic vein. So I introduce this now in case you go and read the book, even though I polled the class before and half of you don't read the book. But if you read the book and you see right lymphatic duct and then, hey, the right lymphatic duct doesn't exist, this is what the book refers to. This is that division or that dichotomy. On the left-hand side, the thoracic duct is the big daddy duct of the lymphatic system where everything drains except for one exception. The thoracic duct, you can see rising up from the bottom of the frame, carrying all the lymph from the lower limbs, from the abdomen, and depositing it into the left brachiocephalic trunk at the point where the left subclavian and left jugular veins merge. So all of the fat being absorbed from the digestive system enters the blood right about here. That was the point that Matt made in lab. One exception to that is the left bronchomediastinal trunk, which doesn't tend to merge with the thoracic duct and enters individually. So if you were to summarize, the major ducts that return lymph to the blood are jugular, subclavian, bronchomediastinal. On the right-hand side, they all do it independently. That yellow area is drained through 3 different trunks. They all return lymph independently. On the left side, only the really hard one to remember, the long word, the bronchomediastinal, returns lymph independently. All of the other trunks from the lower limbs, the lumbar trunks, the intestinal trunk, the jugular, the subclavian, they all merge into the thoracic duct, the most important, most noticeable, longest lymphatic duct in the body. So let's then put it all together and examine flow. Let's recap the overall flow. You have the sequence listed by name on your slide, but we'll just take a little journey through the lymphatic system briefly here. Notice the pulmonary and systemic circulations are divided. The same thing happens in each, and it starts at the systemic, or the capillaries, the arterial capillaries. So, small substances, fluid, easily move out of the capillaries into the interstitial fluid. Plasma is easily filtered out from the capillaries into the interstitial space where it forms interstitial fluid. And this is the starting point of lymph. This is the starting point of movement into the lymphatic system. The capillaries on the vascular side are in close association with lymphatic capillaries. Many plexuses and networks in close approximation. So fluid that's trapped in the interstitial fluid easily moves into the lymphatic system. Lost proteins easily move into the lymphatic system. And these travel through lymph nodes, which we'll get more detail on coming up. But these are major sites of filtration and the first stop in the immune defenses of the body. Travels through lymphatic vessels to lymph nodes and away from lymph nodes into eventually lymphatic trunks and lymphatic ducts. Notice also, flow through the lymphatic system is unidirectional. The valves, the overlapping cells in the capillaries seal so nothing can escape, and we have one-way valves in the lymphatic vessels, a lot like we do on the venous side, that allow lymph to flow through and prevent backflow. Then these merge into lymphatic ducts, which eventually, through the means that we talked about on the last slide, drain back onto the venous side, drain into the left and right brachiocephalic trunks, or brachiocephalic veins on the venous side, and return any of that lost protein, fluid, etc., back to the blood. That circuit is the exact same on the pulmonary side. If fluid is filtered out at the pulmonary capillaries, it becomes interstitial fluid, It flows into lymphatic capillaries in the lung, again through vessels and lymph nodes, out of the jugular trunk, or not the jugular trunk, bronchomediastinal trunk. I'm thinking of something else. Eventually merging with the major ducts and returning to the blood. All of these things, this circuit is the same on either side. Notice too that with the close association with arteries and veins, and we haven't mentioned this yet, but the low pressure in the lymphatic system, movement is largely the result of the same pumps that we saw on the venous side, the same methods that encouraged venous return, the respiratory pump and the muscle pump. Those move blood back to the heart on the venous side, and they also move lymph up the lymphatic system back towards the venous circulation. Again, leveraging the one-way valves, pushing the lymph forward, allowing them to catch it. The respiratory pump creating a negative pressure, helping pull lymph back towards the central cavity, the thorax of the chest. Muscular pumps and respiratory pumps moving lymph as well as venous blood. So let me just poll, since we had trouble at the start. Have you been able to answer all the questions? Big resounding yes. Did you get them all right? No. Head shakes no. Any questions about the questions? Is there anything that's unclear? I don't know if I should maybe I shouldn't even do that, but is the quiz fairly clear? Yeah? Because if there are issues, I'll help you out right now. No? Okay. So this is a natural break point. There are 10 minutes left, but I think that let's call it here for the day, because we're going to start going into depth on the thymus and lymph nodes and a lot of detail on the disease resistance and immune responses. So let's break here for now. I'll see you tomorrow. Have a wonderful Thursday.